In my home, you spoke 6 languages perfectly or you stayed completely silent. When I was 8 and mistakenly used a French word while I was supposed to be speaking Spanish, my mom slapped me so hard across the face that I fell out of my chair. You see, neither of my parents spoke anything other than English, but they were utterly obsessed with the idea that multilingual people were superior and that they destroyed their own lives by only knowing one language. Can you imagine living a life where every single word you utter is a potential weapon against you? Where your own parents, desperate for a twisted idea of success, turned your home into a linguistic prison? I thought I was strong enough to survive it, but then my little brother broke and everything changed. What the hell happened next, you ask? Well, let me tell you. My parents, they were obsessed with languages. Like, truly obsessed. They'd sit there, watching these videos of polyglots, and my mom would literally cry about how beautiful it was and how stupid she felt. And my dad? He'd get drunk and just rant about how if he'd learned languages as a kid, he could have been someone, not just stuck in a warehouse. So, when my older sister, Louise, was born, they made a decision. Their kids would be different. We would be fluent. It started like this. Every single day of the week was a different language. Monday, French. Tuesday, German. Wednesday, Mandarin. Thursday, Arabic. Friday, Russian. Saturday, Japanese. Sunday was just review, a whirlwind of all of them. And here's the kicker. You only spoke that language all day long. If you accidentally spoke English or, God forbid, mixed up languages, the punishment was instant. No dinner. Locked in your room for hours. Sometimes Mom would make you write lines, hundreds of them, in the language you messed up. We had tutors, too, every single day after school. My parents didn't understand a word they were teaching, but they'd just sit there watching us like hawks, making sure we looked like we were learning. My brother, Wyatt, he was only 11, and he was already having panic attacks before his lessons because the tutors would report back to our parents if we weren't progressing fast enough. Mom and Dad, they'd record us, send the videos to distant relatives, post them online. Look at our genius children, they'd say. And if anyone complimented our language skills, they'd puff up, acting like they had personally accomplished something amazing, even though they couldn't understand a single word. It was infuriating. Then, when I turned 13, Mom and Dad sat me down. 2 years, they said. 2 years to become fluent in all 6 languages, or they were shipping me off to some boarding school in Europe. Specialized in intensive language learning, they called it. I saw the brochure. It looked like a prison. Kids in uniform, silent classrooms, no phone calls home, no visits for the first year. We've already contacted them, Dad said, his voice flat. They're expecting you unless you prove you can do this. I was already studying for hours a day after school, utterly exhausted. My regular school grades were tanking because I was too tired to focus on anything but languages. Wyatt? He was falling apart. Nightmares about the tutors every single night. One day I just snapped. During my Mandarin lesson, I started making up gibberish. Sounds vaguely like Mandarin, but completely meaningless. I told the tutor I'd been practicing with some advanced materials. He looked confused, asked me to repeat myself. I just kept going, stringing together nonsense. When my parents asked how it went, the tutor said I'd been speaking something he didn't recognize. I played dumb. Oh, that's a regional dialect I learned from online videos, I said, all innocent. He's just not educated enough to understand it. And for 2 weeks, it worked. I got away with it, just speaking nonsense during lessons, telling my parents the tutors weren't qualified. Wyatt caught on. He started doing it too. It was a lifeline, a small, desperate moment of relief. But it didn't last. Mom and Dad, they brought in the big guns. Real linguistics professors from the university, fluent in all 6 languages. They tested us for hours. And of course, they figured it out immediately. We'd been faking. When the experts told my parents, Dad went absolutely insane. He grabbed all our language books, and started throwing them at us, one by one. Mom was screaming, "How embarrassing! You've made us look like fools." They grounded us for 2 months and, of course, doubled our study time. Now we had tutors in the morning before school and at night after school and all weekend. I was getting maybe 3 hours of sleep, falling asleep in class. I couldn't take it anymore. I went to my school counselor, Mrs. Sutherland. I showed her the bruises on my arms from where Dad had thrown the books. She called Child Protective Services, and that same day they removed me and Wyatt. We stayed with a foster family for 2 months, and for the first time in my life, I could just speak English whenever I wanted. I didn't have to think about conjugating verbs or remembering tones. Wyatt started sleeping through the night. I actually started enjoying school again. It was freedom, then family court. My mom and dad showed up with their lawyer and all 6 of our tutors. The tutors testified that we were making good progress, that multilingual education was beneficial. The linguistics professors, the ones who caught our fake language, even they said that while our parents' methods were strict, we were genuinely learning, and removing us would waste years of progress. And then Louise, my older sister, testified. She said she was grateful for her upbringing, that Wyatt and I were just being lazy. The judge ruled that we had to go back home. My heart just sank. That night, Dad sat us down at the kitchen table. His voice was low, chilling. "From now on," he said, "there is no more English in this house. You speak the 6 languages, or you don't speak at all." I just sat there, frozen, my hands pressed flat against the table, trying to stop them from shaking. Dad's eyes moved from me to Wyatt and back again, waiting for one of us to mess up, to say something in English, so he could prove his point. Wyatt stared down at his lap, his chest heaving, trying not to cry. The silence stretched out so long my ears started ringing. Finally, Dad pushed back from the table and walked out. Mom followed him, not even looking at us. I grabbed Wyatt's hand under the table, just one squeeze before letting go, because even that felt dangerous now. We sat there for maybe 10 more minutes, not moving. Then I got up and went to my room. The language schedule was already taped to my door. Monday, French. Tuesday, German. Wednesday, Mandarin. The same schedule that had controlled my life since I was little. Except now there was no escape. I changed into pajamas and got into bed, even though it was only 8 o'clock, because I didn't know what else to do. Through the wall, I could hear Wyatt moving around in his room. I pressed my palm against the wall, wishing I could tell him we'd figure something out. But I didn't even believe it myself. The next morning, Mom woke us up at 6 instead of 7. When I stumbled into the kitchen, new schedules were taped to every single wall. Kitchen, living room, hallway, bathroom, even inside the pantry. Everywhere I looked, those 6 languages stared at me. Mom pointed to the Monday French schedule and said something in French that I'm pretty sure meant we're starting now. I forced my brain to switch over, responded in French that I understood, and she nodded, handing me a bowl for cereal. Wyatt came in, looking half asleep. Mom snapped at him in French to wake up, and he flinched, but answered back. We ate breakfast in French, got ready for school in French. And even though I'd been doing this for years, it felt different now. Heavier, like the words were made of rocks I had to carry around. At school, I could finally speak English again. It was such a relief, I almost cried in homeroom. But by Tuesday night, I was so tired I could barely think. The German tutor left at 7, and I still had 2 hours of homework. I was staring at verb conjugations that kept blurring together. My head dropped forward and I jerked awake. It happened again. The third time, I didn't wake up until Mom was shaking my shoulder hard enough to hurt. She was yelling at me in German, and I tried to focus, but my brain felt like mud. She made me sit at the table and finish every single problem, standing over me the whole time to make sure I didn't fall asleep again. When I finally finished, it was almost midnight. I had to be up in 6 hours. I dragged myself to bed and passed out. and then the alarm was going off, and I felt like I hadn't slept at all. The next day, I could barely keep my eyes open during math. My teacher asked if I was okay, but I just nodded and tried to sit up straighter. Wednesday night, I waited until everyone was asleep. I snuck into the kitchen where our backpacks hung by the door. My hands shook as I tore a tiny piece of paper from my notebook and wrote in English. "We'll get through this together." Just seeing English words that I chose to write, not because someone forced me, made my throat tight. I folded the paper as small as it would go and slipped it into the front pocket of Wyatt's backpack. Then I hurried back to my room before anyone caught me. Thursday morning was Arabic day, and I was exhausted before breakfast even started. We sat at the table conjugating Arabic verbs out loud while Mom watched us, and I saw Wyatt's hand go to his backpack pocket. He pulled out the tiny folded paper. His eyes went wide. Mom was looking down at her phone, so she didn't notice when he read it. For just a second, Wyatt looked at me and gave the smallest nod. So small I almost missed it. And then he went back to reciting Arabic verb forms like nothing happened. But that tiny connection, that moment where we acknowledged each other in our real language, felt like the only true thing in this whole nightmare. I wanted to cry and smile at the same time, but instead I just kept conjugating verbs in Arabic and pretended everything was normal. Friday afternoon at school, I was walking to my locker when I had to stop and lean against the wall, so dizzy from being tired. Mrs. Sutherland, my school counselor, came around the corner and saw me there. She walked over and asked if everything was okay at home. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to explain about the language-only rule and the schedules on every wall, and how I was getting maybe 4 hours of sleep a night, and how Mom made me stay up until midnight. But I was terrified. Terrified that if I told her, she'd call CPS again, we'd go to court again, the judge would send us back again, and next time it might be even worse. So I just said I was having trouble sleeping. She gave me this look that said she knew I wasn't telling her the whole truth. She asked if I was sure, and I nodded, said I was fine. She told me her door was always open. I thanked her and walked away, even though everything in me was screaming to turn around and tell her the truth. That weekend, during Sunday review, where we were supposed to practice all 6 languages by switching between them, I was so tired I forgot which language I was supposed to be using. Dad asked me a question in French, and I started to answer in French, but then I turned to Wyatt and whispered in English that I couldn't remember the word for something. It was barely a whisper, just a quick, quiet word. But Dad heard it. He stood up so fast his chair fell over backward, and I knew I had messed up bad. Before I could move, he grabbed the thick Russian textbook off the table and threw it at me. The corner hit my shoulder hard. Pain shot down my arm. I fell sideways out of my chair and landed on the floor. The pain was so sharp I had to bite my lip hard to keep from crying, because I knew if I cried it would make him angrier. Dad was standing over me, yelling in English about how I broke the rule. The irony that he was yelling at me in English for speaking English would have been funny if I wasn't so scared. Mom came in and started yelling too. Wyatt was pressed back in his chair, looking terrified. I got up slowly, my shoulder throbbing. Dad told me to go to my room and not come out until dinner. I went upstairs and sat on my bed, pulling my shirt down to look at my shoulder. There was already a dark bruise forming where the book hit me. I stared at it, and something shifted inside me. I couldn't keep living like this. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew I had to do something, or I was going to break completely. Monday morning, I was back in French mode, my shoulder still aching under my shirt. During lunch, I went to the library instead of the cafeteria. I found my science textbook in my locker, opened it up, and looked at the inside of the front cover where there's a pocket for papers. I took out a piece of notebook paper and started writing. In English, it felt like breathing after being underwater. I wrote the date. Then, Dad threw a book at me yesterday, and it left a bruise on my shoulder. I wrote about the language-only rule, about falling asleep during homework and Mom making me stay up until midnight. I wrote about being so tired I could barely think. When I was done, I folded the paper small and slid it into the textbook cover pocket where no one would find it. I decided I was going to keep writing everything down. Every punishment, every time they hit us, or didn't let us eat, or made us stay up too late. I didn't know what I'd do with it yet, but at least I'd have proof. At least I'd have something written in my own language that they couldn't take away from me. The act of writing it made me feel a little bit less powerless, like I was holding on to a piece of myself, even though they were trying to control everything else. The next Wednesday, I was in my room after school, trying to start my Mandarin homework, when I heard Wyatt's door open. His Mandarin tutor, Isabella, was supposed to arrive in 10 minutes. I heard Wyatt go to the bathroom, and then I heard this sound that made my stomach drop. He was breathing too fast, these quick, gasping breaths, and then he started crying. I ran into the hallway and found him sitting on the bathroom floor, back against the wall, crying and hyperventilating. I dropped down next to him and grabbed his hands. They were shaking. I started talking to him in English, whispering as quiet as I could, because if our parents heard us, we were dead. I told him to breathe with me. In for 4 counts, out for 4 counts, the way our foster mom taught us. Wyatt tried, but he couldn't slow his breathing down. He kept saying in English, "I can't breathe. I can't do this anymore." I kept coaching him through the exercises, counting out loud in the quietest whisper I could manage. Slowly, his breathing started to even out. His face was red and wet with tears and snot. I used toilet paper to help him clean up. The doorbell rang. That was Isabella. Wyatt's eyes went wide with panic. "It's okay," I told him. "Just get through this one lesson." I helped him stand up, even though his legs were shaky. We went downstairs together. Mom was already letting Isabella in. I could see Wyatt was still trembling. Isabella set up her materials at the dining room table, like always. But when she looked at Wyatt, her expression changed. His eyes were red and puffy, his hands still shaking. Mom and Dad were standing in the doorway, watching like they always did. But I saw Isabella glance at them, and something shifted in her face. She started the lesson in Mandarin, asking Wyatt simple questions, but she kept looking at him with this concerned expression. Every few minutes, she glanced toward the doorway where our parents stood, and I could tell she was seeing something she didn't like. Wyatt tried to focus, but his voice kept shaking when he answered her. Isabella wrote something in her notebook, but I could tell it wasn't about Mandarin grammar. She kept the lesson shorter than usual, only 45 minutes. When she packed up, she looked at Wyatt one more time, worry in her eyes. After she left, I wondered if she might actually help us. If she might be someone who would do something instead of just looking away like most adults did. But I didn't let myself hope too much, because hoping just makes it hurt worse when nothing changes. That weekend, Mom and Dad called Wyatt and me into the living room. "We have an announcement," Dad said, pulling out his laptop. He showed us router logs, pages of every website anyone in the house had visited. "From now on," he said, "we're checking these logs every single night to make sure you're only looking at language learning websites." Mom added that they'd check our phones and tablets every night too, to make sure we weren't wasting time on anything not language related. I felt the walls of the house closing in on me. Every possible way to reach the outside world was being cut off. No secret emails. No looking up anything that might help us. No connection to anyone who might understand what we were going through. That night, I lay in bed, my chest tight, like I couldn't get enough air. I started breathing too fast. I was having the same kind of panic attack Wyatt had. I forced myself to do the breathing exercises, counting in my head. Slowly, the panic faded, but the fear? That didn't. The house felt like a prison that kept getting smaller, the walls moving in a little bit more every day. Monday morning, Isabella arrived for my Mandarin lesson, and I noticed right away that something was different about her. Her hands were shaking a little bit when she set out her books and papers, and she kept glancing at me instead of starting the lesson right away. I was wearing a short-sleeve shirt because it was warm out, and the bruise on my arm from where Dad threw the book was visible. Faded to yellow-green now, but still obvious. Isabella stared at it for a long moment, and I saw her swallow hard. Mom and Dad were in the doorway, like always, watching us. Isabella started the lesson in Mandarin, but a few minutes later, Mom said something about needing to check on dinner, and she and Dad both stepped away from the doorway. The second they were gone, Isabella leaned forward and asked, very quietly in English, "Are you okay?" Her voice was so gentle and concerned that I felt tears start to build up behind my eyes. I wanted to tell her everything, but I was terrified. So I just shook my head a tiny bit and looked down at the table. She reached across and touched my hand for just a second, and then Mom and Dad came back, and she switched back to Mandarin like nothing happened. But that small moment, someone asking if I was okay in English, someone seeing me as a real person instead of just a language learning project, it made me want to cry with relief and sadness at the same time. On Tuesday during lunch, I slipped away from the cafeteria and headed to the library instead of eating. My stomach felt tight, but I wasn't hungry anyway. I found an empty computer in the back corner where nobody could see the screen from behind me, and I sat down and logged into the school system. I created a new email account using a fake name my parents wouldn't recognize if they somehow found it. My hand shook a little as I typed Mrs. Sutherland's school email address into the recipient field. I kept the message short and vague because I was scared someone else might read it. I wrote that things at home have gotten worse with the language situation and asked if we could talk privately sometime soon. I read it 3 times to make sure I hadn't said anything too specific that could get me in trouble. Then I clicked send and watched the message disappear from the outbox. I opened the browser history and deleted every single entry from the past hour. I cleared the cache and cookies too, just to be safe. Then I logged out of the computer and wiped the keyboard with my sleeve, like that would somehow erase any trace of what I just did. I walked back to the cafeteria and grabbed an apple from the lunch line, even though there were only 10 minutes left in the period. The next day, I checked my new email account during study hall. There was a response from Mrs. Sutherland. She said we could meet during my study hall on Thursday and promised to keep everything we talked about private. Reading those words made my chest feel less tight for the first time in days. But then I started worrying about what I was going to say and how much I should tell her. I spent Wednesday and Thursday morning going over it in my head. I practiced describing the daily language schedule and the way Mom and Dad punished us when we messed up. I tried to find words that would make her understand how bad it really was, without sounding like I was making things up or being dramatic. I was scared that if I said too much, they'd just send us back home again, like the judge did last time. On Saturday morning, Dad asked to see my phone while we were eating breakfast. My whole body went cold because I forgot to delete the email conversation with Mrs. Sutherland. He scrolled through my school email, and I watched his face get more focused as he read. I reached across the table and took the phone back quickly. "I was just emailing my science teacher about homework," I said, trying to sound casual. Dad stared at me for a long moment, and I could hear my heart beating in my ears. He grunted and told me to stay focused on languages and handed the phone back. I waited until he left the kitchen, and then I deleted every single email between me and Mrs. Sutherland. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the phone. By Wednesday night, I'd made up my mind. I had to tell Mrs. Sutherland everything. I lay in bed after my parents checked that I was asleep, and I whispered to myself about the schedule and the punishments and how tired I was all the time. I tried to describe what it felt like to get hit with a book or to go to bed hungry because I used the wrong language. I wanted to find the right words that would make an adult understand this isn't normal and we need help. Thursday afternoon, I went to Mrs. Sutherland's office during study hall. She closed the door and asked me to sit down. I rolled up my sleeves and showed her the bruises on my arms from where Dad grabbed me last week. Then I turned around and lifted up the back of my shirt to show her the bruise on my shoulder blade from where a textbook hit me. Her face went really pale, and she asked if she could take pictures. I nodded, and she used her phone to photograph each bruise. Then I told her about the language-only rule, and how we couldn't speak English at all anymore. I described how Dad throws books at us when we make mistakes, and how Mom makes us go without dinner. Mrs. Sutherland wrote everything down in a notebook, and her hand was shaking a little. When I finished talking, she looked right at me and said she was going to help us. She promised that this time would be different. I felt something crack open inside my chest, and I had to blink really fast so I didn't cry. Before I left, Mrs. Sutherland opened a drawer and pulled out a small MP3 recorder. "It's from the Lost and Found," she said. "Nobody has claimed it in over a year." She showed me how to turn it on and how to hide it in my pocket so the microphone still worked. She said if I could record what happens at home, it would help prove what I was telling her was true. I put the recorder in my jeans pocket and practiced walking around to make sure it didn't show. It felt scary to have it, but also like I was finally doing something real instead of just trying to survive. The next week, I failed my science quiz because I was so tired I could barely remember what the questions were asking. I stared at the paper and tried to focus, but the words just blurred together. My teacher emailed my parents that same day about my declining grades. That night, Dad exploded. He yelled at me in English about how I was wasting all the money they'd spent on tutors and how I was throwing away my future. I noticed he was breaking his own language rule by yelling at me in English, but I didn't say anything because that would just make him angrier. He said if I couldn't do better in school and with languages, then I was worthless. On Wednesday, Mom announced a new rule. She handed me and Wyatt each a pair of earbuds and said we had to wear them all the time, except during tutoring sessions and when we were sleeping. She'd loaded them with language lesson recordings that played on a loop. I put them in and immediately heard a woman's voice speaking French vocabulary words. The voice didn't stop. It just kept going and going with words and grammar rules. I tried to do my homework, but the constant stream of French in my ears made it impossible to think. I started hiding in the bathroom just to pull the earbuds out for 60 seconds and hear silence. Thursday afternoon, I was doing my homework in the kitchen when Wyatt had his Mandarin lesson with Isabella in the dining room. I could hear them through the doorway. Wyatt was reciting something in Chinese, and then suddenly he just stopped. I looked up and saw him staring at the wall, mouth slightly open. He wasn't blinking or moving at all. Isabella leaned forward and said his name, but he didn't respond. She looked really worried and glanced toward the hallway where Mom and Dad were standing and watching. Then she picked up her pen and wrote something in her notebook, and I could tell it wasn't about Chinese grammar. She was writing about what she just saw. On Friday, Dad was yelling at us about our progress reports, and I remembered the MP3 recorder in my pocket. I reached down and pressed the record button through the fabric. Dad's voice got louder and meaner as he talked about sending us to that boarding school in Europe if we didn't improve. He described how we'd be there for a whole year with no phone calls home and no visits. His voice filled the kitchen, and I kept my hand near my pocket to make sure the recorder was still running. When he finally stopped yelling, I waited until I was alone, and then I stopped the recording. The next day at school, I went to the library and logged into a cloud storage account I created. I uploaded the audio file with shaking hands. The progress bar moved slowly across the screen, and I kept looking over my shoulder to make sure nobody was watching. When the file finished uploading, I felt like I'd just done something that might actually matter this time. The next Wednesday, Mom and Dad called us into the living room after dinner. Dad had this weird, excited look on his face that made my stomach twist. He explained they'd arranged for a special immersion weekend, where one of our tutors would stay at the house the entire time to make sure we were only speaking our assigned languages, even at night. Mom added that we'd sleep in shifts so we could maximize our learning time. My throat got tight because that meant there wouldn't be any escape at all, not even when everyone else was asleep. I glanced at Wyatt and watched all the color drain from his face until he looked almost gray, and his hands started shaking on the armrest of the couch. Dad kept talking about how this would really push us to the next level. Mom nodded along like this was the most reasonable plan in the world. But all I could think about was how I wouldn't even have my bed as a safe space anymore. That Saturday morning, the tutor arrived with an overnight bag and set up camp in our dining room where he could monitor both of our study areas. The hours blurred together with Russian vocabulary drills and grammar exercises, and I could feel my brain getting fuzzy from exhaustion. Around 3 in the afternoon, I heard Dad's voice getting louder from Wyatt's area, and I knew my brother must have mixed something up. Dad was yelling about how Wyatt said an Arabic word when today was supposed to be Russian day, and his voice kept rising until I heard something crash. Then there was a knock at the front door, and everything went quiet. I peeked around the corner and saw Mr. Park from next door standing on our porch, looking concerned. Dad opened the door, and his whole face changed like someone flipped a switch. Suddenly, all smiles and friendly neighbor energy. Mr. Park asked if everything was okay because he heard shouting. Dad laughed this fake laugh and explained we were just doing some intensive study sessions. You know how kids are, he said. They need firm guidance to reach their potential. I watched Mr. Park's face. He looked uncertain, glancing past Dad toward where I was standing in the hallway. But then he nodded slowly and said something about keeping the noise down. Dad thanked him and closed the door. My brief, stupid hope that someone would actually do something died right there in my chest. The rest of the weekend dragged on with the tutor watching our every move. I barely slept at all during my designated rest periods. By Monday morning, back at school, I felt like a zombie walking through the halls. During lunch, I hid in the computer lab and created an anonymous account on a teen support forum I found last week. My hands shook as I typed out a post describing the language schedule, without using any real names or details that could identify us. I wrote about the constant pressure and the punishments, and the feeling of never being able to relax, even for a second. Just getting the words out to people who might understand made something loosen in my chest that had been tight for weeks. I checked back during study hall, and there were already 3 responses. They all said basically the same thing. This isn't normal. Parents shouldn't treat their kids this way. You're not crazy for thinking something is wrong. Reading those words from strangers who had no reason to lie to me felt like someone finally turned on a light in a dark room. On Wednesday, Mrs. Sutherland called me to her office during my free period. When I got there, she was smiling in a way that made me think something good might be happening. She told me she'd been making some calls, and she connected with a child advocate attorney who works with kids in difficult family situations. The attorney agreed to do an informal consultation about our case, and Mrs. Sutherland had already sent her copies of the photos and some of my documentation. She explained that just because the previous CPS case got closed doesn't mean we can't report again, especially now that we have new evidence of ongoing problems. The attorney thinks we might have a stronger case this time with all the documentation I'd been gathering. And suddenly I had an actual plan instead of just collecting evidence and hoping. Mrs. Sutherland gave me the attorney's contact information written on a sticky note, and I folded it up small and hid it in my phone case. By Thursday morning, I woke up with a slight fever. My head felt heavy and achy. I told Mom I thought I was getting sick and asked if I could skip my Arabic tutoring session, but she just felt my forehead and said I was fine, that I was probably just tired from the immersion weekend. The tutor arrived at 4, and I sat at the kitchen table trying to focus on conjugations while my head pounded and my throat hurt. Every Arabic word felt like it was scraping against sandpaper, and I had to keep stopping to swallow. The tutor kept glancing at me with this uncomfortable expression, but he didn't say anything to my parents, who were watching from the living room. I realized in that moment that most adults will just look away rather than get involved, even when they can see something isn't right. That weekend, I was feeling better physically, but the house was tense because Dad was in a bad mood about something at work. On Saturday afternoon, during my Japanese lesson, I heard him start yelling at Wyatt in the other room about his Russian pronunciation from yesterday. I reached into my pocket and pressed record on my phone, just as something crashed against the wall. Dad's voice got louder, and I could hear him threatening to send Wyatt to that boarding school in Europe if he didn't start taking this seriously. There was the sound of another crash, and I realized he was throwing things. When it finally went quiet, I waited until I was alone in my room that night and listened to the recording with my earbuds in. Hearing Dad's voice, that angry and out of control, made me shake. But I saved the file carefully because this was exactly the kind of evidence that might actually make a difference to people who have the power to help us. On Tuesday of week 8, I was in math class when the intercom crackled and asked for Wyatt to report to the nurse's office. I spent the rest of the period worried about what happened. At lunch, I found out from a kid in his grade that Wyatt had some kind of panic attack during science. Apparently, he just started hyperventilating and couldn't calm down, and the teacher had to walk him to the nurse. The nurse called our parents to come pick him up, and I watched through the front office windows as Mom arrived, looking annoyed. Later, I learned from Mrs. Sutherland that the school nurse documented everything in Wyatt's file and filed a report with CPS about concerns for his mental health, which means the system was finally starting to pay attention again, even if it was moving slowly. 2 days later, on Thursday afternoon, I was doing homework at the kitchen table when there was a knock at the door. Mom answered it, and I heard her voice go high and fake pleasant as she greeted someone. I looked up and saw a woman in business clothes with a CPS badge clipped to her belt. My heart started racing. This was an unannounced visit, which meant they were actually taking things seriously. I watched Mom and Dad transform right in front of my eyes into concerned, reasonable parents who just want the best for their children. They invited the caseworker in and showed her our study schedules posted on the walls, explaining their philosophy about the importance of multilingual education. Dad pulled out the tutor's contact information and credentials like he was presenting evidence of their dedication to our future. Mom talked about high academic standards and how sometimes kids need structure and discipline. The caseworker nodded and took notes and asked us a few questions, but with our parents standing right there, I couldn't say anything real. I watched the whole performance, feeling hopeless because they're so good at this, at looking like normal parents who maybe push a little hard, but only because they care. After the caseworker left and said she'd be in touch, I waited until I was alone and texted Mrs. Sutherland using the code phrase we agreed on. I wrote that I needed to discuss my science project, which was our signal that something happened and she should request another surprise welfare check. It felt good to have some control over the situation, even if it was just small moves in a bigger game where the adults held all the real power. The next Monday, Isabella arrived for my Mandarin session, and she seemed nervous, fidgeting with her teaching materials more than usual. Halfway through the lesson, when Mom stepped into the kitchen to take a phone call, Isabella did something brave. She tore a tiny piece of paper from her notebook and wrote something on it quickly, then slid it across the table while whispering in Mandarin that if I ever needed help to contact her. I glanced down and saw a phone number written in small, neat digits. I palmed the paper and slipped it into my shoe while nodding slightly to show I understood. When the lesson ended and Isabella packed up to leave, I felt this surge of gratitude that at least one adult was willing to stick their neck out for us, even in this small, quiet way that my parents hopefully wouldn't notice. Thursday morning, I was in the kitchen doing my Arabic homework when the MP3 recorder slipped out of my hoodie pocket and hit the floor with a plastic clatter. Dad's head snapped up from his coffee, and he stared at the little black device lying there between us. I watched his face change as he realized what it was, and my whole body went cold. He grabbed it before I could move and turned it over in his hands, pressing buttons until he heard his own voice yelling from 2 nights ago. The recorder exploded against the kitchen counter, pieces of plastic scattering across the floor like shrapnel, Dad screaming about betrayal and spying, and how dare I record my own family? His face turning red as he picked up chunks of the broken device and threw them at me. One piece hit my cheek, and I felt a sharp sting, but I didn't move or speak. I just stood there watching my evidence plan fall apart in front of me. All those hours of careful documentation destroyed in seconds. Mom came running and demanded to know what was happening, and Dad showed her the broken pieces, explaining what I'd been doing. She started crying about trust and how they'd given us everything. And this is how we repay them. I kept my mouth shut about the cloud backups and the school Chromebook, because if they knew about those, they'd take everything away. I let them think they'd won, that they destroyed my only way of gathering proof. Dad grounded me for a month and took my phone right there, going through it to delete anything suspicious. But he didn't find the cloud account because I used a different login. That night, I lay in bed thinking about all the recordings that were still safe online, all the evidence they didn't know existed. By Friday, I'd completely changed my strategy. I was using the school Chromebook during study hall to record conversations through its built-in microphone. The technology teacher showed us how to use the recording software for a project last month, and now I was putting that knowledge to work. I created a new folder with an innocent name like History Research and saved all my audio files there with timestamps. Every day, I uploaded everything to the cloud before I left school. So, even if they took the Chromebook away, the evidence was preserved somewhere they couldn't reach. The whole system felt like a lifeline, the only way to prove what happens behind our closed doors when no one else is watching. I became really methodical about it, keeping a spreadsheet of what I'd recorded and when, making sure I captured different types of incidents so there was a pattern. During lunch, I sat in the library and organized my files, creating a timeline of abuse that someone official might actually believe. The librarian asked what I was working on, and I told her it was a family history project, which isn't exactly a lie. I tested the microphone quality and figured out how to reduce background noise, so the voices came through clearly. It's like I was building a case against my own parents, and the thought made me feel guilty and powerful at the same time. That weekend, Mom and Dad set up a live stream for distant relatives who wanted to see how much we'd progressed with our languages. They positioned a camera in the living room and made us sit on the couch in nice clothes while cousins and aunts and uncles logged in from different time zones. For 2 hours, we performed, switching between French and German and Mandarin on command, answering questions about grammar and pronunciation. I could see the viewer count climbing and Mom and Dad beaming like they'd created something amazing. During a break, when they thought the camera was off, Mom pulled me aside and hissed in English that I'd used a French word during the Spanish section. Her hand came up fast and connected with my face before I could react. The sound sharpened the quiet room. My cheek burned, and I blinked back tears while she adjusted the camera and called everyone back for more demonstrations. What I didn't know until later is that one of my online forum friends was watching the live stream and caught the whole thing. She screen captured the moment with Mom's hand in motion and my face twisted in pain. Then another shot showing the red mark on my cheek. She sent me the images through a private message with a note saying she was sorry this was happening and asking if I was safe. The evidence I didn't even plan for landed in my inbox like a gift. Proof that someone outside our house witnessed what goes on here. On Monday morning before school, Wyatt cornered me in the hallway and whispered that he'd been thinking about running away. His eyes were red like he'd been crying, and he told me he couldn't take it anymore, that he'd rather live on the streets than spend another day in this house. I pulled him into the bathroom and locked the door, trying to talk sense into him while keeping my voice down. I reminded him we're only 11 and 13, with nowhere to go and no money, that we'd end up in way worse situations than we were in now. He argued that anything would be better than this, but I could see the fear behind his words, the desperation of a kid who just wants the pain to stop. I convinced him to trust my plan to build enough evidence for CPS to remove us permanently this time, even though I wasn't completely sure I believed it myself. I showed him some of the screenshots and told him about the audio files saved in the cloud, about the child advocate attorney who was reviewing everything. Wyatt's hands shook as he looked at the images on my phone, and I realized how much pressure I was putting on him by asking him to hold on. I promised him that if the plan didn't work in 2 more weeks, we'd figure something else out together. He nodded slowly and wiped his eyes, and we left the bathroom separately so no one got suspicious. All day I watched him in the hallways between classes, making sure he didn't bolt, praying he could hold it together just a little longer. That Wednesday, I locked myself in the bathroom after dinner and carefully photographed the bruises on my ribs from where Dad shoved me into the table edge the night before. I made sure the date and timestamp were visible in the corner of each image, taking multiple angles to show the full extent of the damage. The bruises were dark purple and yellow, spreading across my side in the exact shape of the table corner. I pulled up my email on my phone and composed a message to the child advocate attorney through the secure address Mrs. Sutherland gave me. Writing out exactly how I got each injury made me feel clinical and detached, like I was reporting on someone else's life instead of my own. I described the argument that led to the shove, the impact of my body against the wood, the pain that made it hard to breathe for the next hour. I attached all the photos and hit send before I could second-guess myself. The email disappeared into the internet, and I sat on the bathroom floor wondering if anyone would actually do anything with this information, or if it'd just get filed away with all the other reports that didn't help us the first time. Mom banged on the door asking what was taking so long, and I flushed the toilet for effect before washing my hands and coming out. That night, the bruises throbbed every time I moved, but I didn't take any pain medication because I wanted to remember exactly how this feels. By Thursday afternoon, I got an email from the attorney saying she'd filed an emergency motion for an in-camera interview, where Wyatt and I could talk to the judge privately without our parents present. She explained that this was our chance to tell our story directly to the person who makes decisions about our placement, that the judge would ask us questions about what's been happening, and we needed to be completely honest. I felt hope and terror in equal measure, because this could either save us or make everything so much worse if it didn't work. If the judge didn't believe us or thought we were exaggerating, we'd go right back home, and our parents would know we tried to get away again. The thought of their reaction if we failed made my stomach hurt. I forwarded the email to Wyatt with a short message telling him to be ready to tell the truth when the time comes. He responded with just a thumbs-up emoji, but I knew he was as scared as I was. That night, I couldn't sleep, running through everything I wanted to say to the judge, trying to find words that would make an adult understand how desperate our situation really is. Everything changes on Friday. Mom and Dad called us into the living room before breakfast and announced they were withdrawing us from school to homeschool us. Dad explained that public school was interfering with our language education, and they decided we'd learn better at home with full-time tutors. Mom added that this way they could monitor our progress more closely and make sure we weren't wasting time on subjects that don't matter. I realized immediately what was happening, that they somehow knew something was going on, and they were trying to cut off our access to mandated reporters like Mrs. Sutherland. Without school, we'd have no way to contact anyone outside the house. No opportunity to document what happens or send evidence to the attorney. We spent the whole weekend trapped inside with no phone access and no computer time, except for supervised language practice. The walls felt like they were closing in, and I watched Wyatt retreating into himself, barely speaking, even during meals. I tried to catch his eye to signal that we'd figure something out, but he wouldn't look at me. Sunday night, I lay awake thinking about how perfectly they'd isolated us, how smart they were to realize the danger and shut it down before we could escape. What I didn't know is that Mrs. Sutherland filed a new report with CPS on Monday morning, citing the suspicious timing of our sudden withdrawal from school. She documented the pattern of our parents pulling us out right after the emergency motion was filed, noting that this appeared to be retaliation and an attempt to prevent us from accessing help. She included copies of all the evidence I'd given her and requested an immediate welfare check. I had no way of knowing any of this was happening because I was stuck at home with no contact with the outside world. But later, I'll learn that she refused to let our case drop just because we disappeared from campus. She called the attorney, and they coordinated their efforts, building a case even without our direct involvement. Mrs. Sutherland told the caseworker about the bruises she photographed, the audio recordings, the pattern of escalating abuse, and insisted that our removal from school was itself evidence of danger. The homeschool schedule was absolutely crushing. Tutors arriving at 8 in the morning and staying until 8 at night. Mom or dad supervised every single moment, sitting in the room during lessons and watching us during breaks. I couldn't even go to the bathroom without one of them standing outside the door, asking what was taking so long if I was in there more than 2 minutes. Wyatt and I communicated only in desperate glances across the table, trying to convey support and solidarity without words. The French tutor came at 8, followed by German at 10, Mandarin at noon, Arabic at 2, Russian at 4, and Japanese at 6. We got 15-minute breaks between sessions to eat something quick and use the bathroom. My brain felt like mush by the end of each day, unable to absorb any more vocabulary or grammar rules. At night, I collapsed into bed, too exhausted to even think about escape plans or evidence gathering. The isolation was complete and suffocating. Every hour accounted for, every moment monitored. Late Tuesday night, I woke up at 2 in the morning and realized everyone else was asleep. I slipped out of bed as quietly as possible and crept downstairs, avoiding the creaky spots on the stairs that I'd memorized over the years. I unlocked the back door and stepped into our backyard, the grass cold and wet under my bare feet. I pulled out my phone, which I'd hidden in my pillowcase, and checked for Wi-Fi signals. Our neighbor's network wasn't password protected, and I connected immediately, my hand shaking as I opened my email. I sent quick updates to Mrs. Sutherland and the attorney, explaining that we'd been withdrawn from school and were being homeschooled with constant supervision. I told them I had no way to gather more evidence or communicate regularly. I attached the screenshots from the live stream that my forum friend sent me, sitting in the dark grass, typing frantically before someone noticed I was gone. I felt like a spy in my own life, stealing moments of connection to the outside world. A light turned on upstairs, and I quickly disconnected, deleted my browser history, and slipped back inside. My heart pounded as I climbed the stairs and slid back into bed, praying no one heard me leave. The phone went back in its hiding spot, and I lay there in the dark, knowing that message might be my last contact with anyone who could help us. On Wednesday, I waited until everyone was at lunch and slipped into the hallway bathroom with my phone. My hands shook as I opened the camera app and switched it to video mode. I walked back to the dining room where the dent in the wall was still visible from where Dad threw that book at Wyatt last week. I grabbed a ruler from the kitchen drawer and held it up next to the dent, making sure both were clearly in frame. I hit record and spoke quietly but clearly into the phone. I said the date, the time, and explained what caused the damage. My voice sounded weird and formal, like I was giving a report, but I figured that's what you're supposed to do for evidence. The ruler showed the dent was about 3 inches deep, and the paint was cracked around the edges. I filmed for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped and watched it back to make sure everything was visible. The video felt like insurance, like proof that this is really happening, and I'm not making it up or exaggerating. I uploaded it to the cloud account immediately and deleted it from my phone, just in case Dad checked my device again. My heart pounded the whole time I was doing this, because if they caught me gathering evidence like this, I didn't know what they'd do. Thursday evening, I was in the middle of my Russian lesson when I heard a car pull into the driveway. The tutor kept going, but I could see Mom and Dad both get up and look out the window. Their faces changed in a way that made my stomach drop. Mom walked to the front door, and I heard her voice go high and fake polite. Dad joined her, and I caught the words police officers through the doorway. The tutor stopped mid-sentence, and we all just sat there frozen. A woman's voice asked if she could come in and speak with the children. That's the CPS caseworker from before. I recognized her tone. Mom said, "Of course, they're always happy to cooperate," but her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. 2 police officers came in behind the caseworker, and suddenly the whole energy of the house shifted. Dad couldn't hide his anger, even though he was trying to smile. His jaw was tight, and his voice had this edge to it. The caseworker asked to speak with Wyatt and me separately, and our parents immediately started objecting. They said we were in the middle of important lessons, that this was disruptive, that they weren't given proper notice. But the caseworker just looked at the police officers, and one of them stepped forward slightly. Dad's mouth snapped shut. Mom's fake smile got even more stretched. The caseworker said it wouldn't take long and asked us to come with her to the kitchen. I felt the power dynamic shifting slightly, like maybe this time they can't just perform their way out of it. During the interview, the caseworker sat across from us at the kitchen table while one officer stood by the door. She asked Wyatt how he was doing, and he just stared at his hands for a long moment. Then he started crying. Not quiet tears, but full sobbing that made his whole body shake. He told her about waking up every night from nightmares about the tutors. He described the panic attacks before lessons where he couldn't breathe and felt like he was dying. He admitted he was scared all the time now. Scared of making mistakes, scared of our parents, scared of the languages themselves. The caseworker listened without interrupting and wrote notes in her folder. She asked if he'd seen a doctor about the panic attacks, and he shook his head. She asked if our parents knew how bad it's gotten, and he said they just tell him to work harder. I watched my little brother finally tell the truth about how much he's suffering, and I felt proud of him and heartbroken at the same time. The caseworker closed her folder and said she was recommending an immediate medical evaluation. She said a doctor needed to assess his mental health and that our parents would be required to take him within 48 hours. Wyatt looked at me with this mix of relief and terror on his face. Our parents were forced to take us to the pediatrician the next Monday. We sat in the waiting room, and Mom kept coaching us in whispered French about what to say if the doctor asked questions. Dad read a magazine, but his leg bounced up and down the whole time. When we finally got called back, the doctor examined Wyatt first while I waited outside with our parents. The appointment took almost an hour. When Wyatt came out, his eyes were red, but he looked calmer. Then it was my turn, and the doctor asked me questions about sleep, appetite, stress levels. She's nice but professional, taking notes on her computer. She doesn't directly accuse our parents of anything, but she documents everything carefully. At the end, she told Mom and Dad that Wyatt shows elevated anxiety symptoms consistent with chronic stress. She recommended therapy and possibly medication if the symptoms continue. She noted it all in his chart with today's date. It wasn't enough to trigger immediate action, but it added to the growing documentation of harm. Another piece of evidence in the case we're building. On the drive home, Dad gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. By Wednesday, the attorney had secured an appointment at the Child Advocacy Center for forensic interviews, scheduled for the following week. The caseworker called to tell us and explained what would happen. Someone specially trained would talk to us about our home situation in a comfortable room with recording equipment. She said to just tell the truth, and that the interview would be used to help the court understand what we're experiencing. After she hung up, I spent days preparing myself mentally to tell everything to a stranger. I practiced in my head what I'd say about the language schedule, the punishments, the fear that's constant now. I thought about which recordings to play and which photos to show. Knowing this might be our last real chance to escape made every moment feel heavy. Wyatt asked me what he should say, and I told him just to be honest about the panic attacks and nightmares. At night, I lay in bed going over every detail I needed to remember, every piece of evidence I'd collected, every moment that proves this isn't normal. My mind won't shut off because I'm terrified of forgetting something important. Early Monday morning, before anyone else was awake, I snuck out of the house and walked to the school to retrieve a flash drive I'd hidden in my locker with copies of all my evidence. The sun was just coming up, and the streets were empty and quiet. My breath made clouds in the cold air. The walk took about 20 minutes, and the whole time I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see Dad's car. The school building was locked, but I knew which side entrance sometimes doesn't latch properly. I slipped inside, and the hallways were dark and echoed with every step. My locker combination took 3 tries because my hands were shaking. The flash drive was right where I left it, taped to the back panel behind my textbooks. I grabbed it and shoved it deep in my pocket. Getting it felt like a small victory, like I'd outsmarted them, at least in this one small way. Dad has confiscated my bags and devices, but he doesn't know about this backup. On the walk home, I took a different route just in case, cutting through yards and side streets. I made it back inside and upstairs before anyone woke up. The flash drive goes into a new hiding spot inside the lining of my winter coat that's hanging in the closet. Louise visited on Sunday, and I hoped she'd finally see what's really happening. She arrived around noon and brought groceries, like she was trying to be helpful. Mom and Dad were all smiles and gratitude, playing the role of reasonable parents with a successful adult daughter. We sat in the living room, and Louise asked how her studies were going. I wanted to tell her everything, but Wyatt shot me a warning look. Instead, I said it's fine, and she seemed satisfied with that. Then she launched into the speech about how grateful she is for her upbringing. She talked about how the language skills have helped her career and made her stand out in job interviews. She said, Mom and Dad pushed her hard, but it made her stronger and more disciplined. She looked right at me and Wyatt and told us we were ungrateful for not appreciating what they're trying to do for us. I felt something break inside my chest. She admitted she felt the same pressure growing up, that there were times she wanted to quit, but she pushed through and now she's glad she did. I realized she's so deep in denial about her own trauma that she can't acknowledge ours. She's convinced herself that the fear and exhaustion and punishment were worth it, and admitting we're suffering would mean admitting she suffered, too. After she leaves, I go to my room and cry. The forensic interview on Wednesday was terrifying and relieving at the same time. The Child Advocacy Center doesn't look scary from the outside, just a regular building with a small waiting area. A woman introduced herself as the interviewer and leads Wyatt and me to separate rooms. Mine had comfortable chairs and soft lighting and toys on shelves, even though I'm too old for toys. The interviewer sat across from me and explained that everything was being recorded, but it's just for the court, not for my parents to see. She asked me to tell her about my home life, and I started with the language schedule. I explained Monday through Sunday, the different languages, the punishments for mistakes. She didn't interrupt or look shocked, just nodded and asked gentle questions. She wanted to know specifics about the punishments. So I described the slapping, the thrown books, the bruises. I showed her photos on the flash drive. Then I told her about the recordings I'd made, and she asked if I could play some. I chose the one where Dad was threatening us about the boarding school. His voice filled the room, angry and mean, and when it ends, she just nodded like she understood exactly how serious this is. We talked for almost 2 hours. She asked about school, friends, sleep, food, everything. By the end, I felt wrung out, but also lighter somehow, like I finally told someone who actually listened. 2 days later, Isabella submitted a formal affidavit to CPS detailing the directive she received from our parents and her concerns about our welfare. I don't know this is happening until the caseworker mentions it during a phone call. She says the tutor provided a detailed statement about what she observed during her time in our home. Reading her statement later through the attorney, I learned she documented Wyatt's panic attacks during lessons, the visible injuries she saw on both of us, and the extreme pressure we were under. She wrote about how her parents monitored every session but couldn't understand what was being taught. She described the fear she saw in our faces and the way we flinched when our parents entered the room. She noted that the language instruction was far beyond age-appropriate levels and that the schedule allowed no time for normal childhood activities. Knowing she was paying attention the whole time makes me feel less invisible, like at least one adult saw what was really happening and decided to do something about it. The emergency hearing happens the following Tuesday, and the attorney tells us to dress nicely. We sat in a courtroom that's smaller than I expected, just the judge and some lawyers and a court reporter. The judge reviewed all the evidence, including the recordings, photos, medical documentation, and witness statements. She listened to parts of the audio files through headphones and her face stayed neutral, but her eyebrows went up at certain points. She read Isabella's affidavit and the pediatrician's notes. She asked the caseworker questions about the home visits and the sudden withdrawal from school. Our parents sat with their lawyer looking tense and angry. When the judge finally speaks, she said she's ordering a safety plan. Our parents have to re-enroll us in school immediately, attend parenting classes twice a week, and submit to unannounced home visits from CPS. She said any violation of the plan will result in immediate removal. She also orders that we continue therapy and that the language tutoring schedule must be reduced to no more than 1 hour per day total. It's not removal, and part of me is disappointed, but it's more protection than we had before. Mom and Dad have to sign the plan right there in front of the judge. Walking out of the courthouse, I feel like maybe things might actually get better, or at least less worse. That night at home, Mom and Dad barely speak to us, except to say the schedule resumes tomorrow, and we better not give them any reason to violate the plan. I can see the anger in their faces. The way Dad's jaw clenches when he looks at me. The way Mom slams dishes in the kitchen. After they go to their room, I pull out my phone and search for safety alert apps, like the caseworker mentioned. I find one that connects directly to the local police dispatch and lets you trigger an emergency response with just 2 taps. Setting it up takes maybe 10 minutes, but my hands shake the whole time because this feels huge. The app sits on my home screen now, a little red button that means I have power I never had before. I can call for help instantly if Dad throws something or Mom locks us in our rooms. The thought makes my chest feel less tight, like I can actually breathe properly for the first time since we came back from foster care. Wyatt asks what I'm doing, and I show him the app, explaining how it works. His eyes go wide and he nods slowly, and I can tell he feels the same relief I do. We're not completely helpless anymore. The safety plan the judge ordered means our parents have to be careful now, and this app means we can prove it if they're not. The court paperwork includes a referral to a trauma therapist, and by Wednesday, I'm sitting in her office for my first session. The therapist is maybe 40 with glasses and a calm voice. Her office has soft lighting and comfortable chairs that don't feel like a doctor's office. She asks me to tell her about what's been happening, and I give her the short version about the languages and the punishments and the removal and having to go back. She listens without interrupting, and when I'm done, she explains that what I'm experiencing is a normal response to ongoing stress and fear. She teaches me this grounding exercise where you name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. We practice it together, and by the end I feel more present in my body instead of floating somewhere above it. She says my racing heart and trouble sleeping and constant anxiety aren't signs that I'm broken or weak. They're my body trying to protect me from danger that's actually real. Hearing that helps somehow, like maybe I'm not as messed up as I thought. Maybe if I get away from the danger, my body will calm down eventually. She gives me a worksheet with more exercises to practice at home, and we schedule another session for next week. Everything falls apart the following Saturday during Wyatt's morning tutoring session. I'm in my room doing homework when I hear Dad's voice getting louder downstairs. That particular tone that means he's about to lose control. I grab my phone and open the safety alert app just in case, then creep to the top of the stairs to listen. Dad is yelling at Wyatt for messing up a grammar structure in Mandarin, saying he's not trying hard enough and wasting everyone's time. The tutor tries to calm him down, but Dad ignores her. Then I hear the sound of something hitting the wall and Wyatt crying out. I don't even think, just hit the emergency button on my phone, twice like the app showed me. A message pops up saying, "Police have been notified and your location has been sent." I run downstairs and find Wyatt on the floor holding his arm, and Dad standing over him with a textbook in his hand. The tutor looks shocked and scared. Mom comes running from the kitchen, asking what happened. I step between Dad and Wyatt and tell him I called the police and they're coming right now. Dad's face goes from red to pale in about 2 seconds. He starts saying it was an accident and Wyatt is fine and I need to call them back and cancel. I don't move. Wyatt is still crying, and I can see a red mark forming on his shoulder where the book hit him. The tutor quietly packs up her materials and says she needs to leave. Mom begs her to stay and explain that this was just a misunderstanding, but the tutor walks out without looking back. We wait in horrible silence for maybe 15 minutes until 2 police officers knock on the door. They come in and ask what happened, and I show them the safety alert I triggered. They ask to speak with Wyatt alone, and he tells them Dad threw the book at him during his lesson. The officers take photos of the mark on his shoulder and the book on the floor. They write down the tutor's name and contact information. One officer tells Dad that throwing objects at a child violates the safety plan, and they're documenting this incident for the court. Dad tries to argue that it barely touched Wyatt and he was just frustrated. But the officer cuts him off and says the judge will decide what happens next. Watching Dad's face as he realizes the rules really have changed feels satisfying in a way I didn't expect. He can't just do whatever he wants anymore. There are actual consequences now. By Monday morning, I'm back at regular school for the first time in weeks, and it feels strange and wonderful at the same time. Mrs. Sutherland meets me at the office before first period and hands me a folder with my 504 plan inside. She explains that both Wyatt and I now have accommodations, including extra time on tests and assignments, permission to take breaks when we need them, and a pass to come see her anytime. She's also arranged for me to eat lunch in her office if the cafeteria gets too overwhelming. Walking through the halls toward my first class, I hear students speaking English all around me, and nobody is monitoring what language I use or timing my responses. I answer a friend's question about homework in plain English and don't have to translate it in my head first or worry about using the wrong day's language. The relief is so strong, I almost start crying right there by the lockers. In English class, the teacher hands back an essay I wrote before all this happened, and I got a B-, which normally would stress me out, but today just feels manageable. During lunch, I sit with some kids from my science class, and they ask where I've been, and I give a vague answer about family stuff. Nobody pushes for details. The normalcy of it all, the boring, everyday routine of school, feels like the best thing that's ever happened to me. Wednesday at lunch, Wyatt is sitting with some kids from his grade in the cafeteria when I see him suddenly stand up and start breathing too fast. I drop my sandwich and run over as he grabs the edge of the table, looking pale and scared. A few kids back away, looking uncomfortable, but 2 girls from his class move closer, asking if he's okay. I get down next to him and use the grounding exercise my therapist taught me, talking him through, naming things he can see and touch. One of the girls gets the school nurse, and she arrives with a paper bag for him to breathe into. It takes maybe 10 minutes before Wyatt calms down enough to talk, and by then half the cafeteria is staring. The nurse walks him to her office, and I follow, feeling embarrassed and protective at the same time. After school, some kids whisper when I pass them in the hall, and I know they're talking about us. But that night, I check my messages, and 3 different students have sent me supportive texts saying they hope Wyatt is okay and asking if there's anything they can do to help. One girl writes that her cousin has panic attacks too, and shares some resources her family found helpful. It's weird having people know our business, but also kind of nice not carrying this huge secret alone anymore. Maybe having witnesses means we're safer somehow. Friday afternoon, the CPS caseworker pulls Wyatt and me out of class for a meeting in Mrs. Sutherland's office. She brings documentation of the weekend incident with Dad and explains that, combined with the previous violations, she's recommending we be placed in foster care again. She says our parents have shown they can't follow the safety plan, and our welfare is at risk if we stay in their home. The recommendation will go to the judge next week. I feel this weird mix of guilt and relief washing over me. Part of me wants to be safe and away from the constant fear of what Dad might do next. But another part feels like I'm abandoning my parents, even though logically I know they created this whole situation themselves. Wyatt looks scared when the caseworker mentions foster care, and I reach over and squeeze his hand. The caseworker says we'll likely go back to the same foster parent who had us before, since she's already familiar with our case. That makes it slightly less terrifying. At least we know her and she was kind to us. Mrs. Sutherland says she'll help us get our belongings from home and make sure the transition goes smoothly. Walking back to class afterward, I feel like I'm in a dream, like this is happening to someone else, and I'm just watching from outside my body. The following Monday, a social worker picks us up from school with garbage bags for our clothes and drives us to the foster home. The foster mom opens the door and gives us both quick hugs, saying she's glad we're back, even though she wishes it was under better circumstances. The house looks exactly the same as I remember. Comfortable, quiet, and normal. She shows us to our rooms, which still have the same beds and dressers we used before. Dinner is spaghetti, and she doesn't ask us to speak anything except English. Doesn't quiz us on vocabulary or grammar. Doesn't monitor what we say. We just eat and talk about regular stuff like school and homework and what we want to watch on TV later. The absence of pressure feels so big. I don't know what to do with all the empty space in my head where stress used to live. After dinner, I help load the dishwasher, and the foster mom thanks me, but doesn't make it into some big lesson or test. It's just a normal household chore. That night, lying in bed, I listen to the quiet house and realize I'm not scared about what tomorrow will bring. Nobody is going to burst in and start yelling about languages or throw things or lock me in this room. I'm just going to wake up and go to school and come back here and do homework and sleep. The simplicity of it feels almost too good to be true. 2 weeks later, we're back in family court and the judge reviews all the recent documentation, including the weekend incident and the tutor statement and the police report. She extends our foster placement for at least 6 months and orders our parents to complete parenting classes and anger management counseling before they can even have supervised visits with us. The judge says in a stern voice that the safety plan was their opportunity to demonstrate they could parent appropriately, and they failed that test. Mom cries in the courtroom, and Dad sits there looking angry and defeated. Louise is there too, and she glares at me like this is all my fault. But I don't look away. The judge's ruling feels like someone in. Authority finally validating that what happened to us was real and wrong. Not just us being difficult kids who didn't appreciate our parents' efforts. Walking out of the courthouse afterward, I feel lighter somehow, like a weight I've been carrying for years just lifted off my shoulders. The caseworker says we'll have check-ins every month and therapy will continue. But for now, we're safe where we are. In my new school, I decide to take Spanish as an elective because I actually want to learn it now that nobody is forcing me. The teacher is young and enthusiastic and makes language learning feel fun instead of like a test I might fail. She teaches us songs and games and cultural information about Spanish-speaking countries. When I mess up a verb conjugation, she just corrects me gently and moves on. No punishment or anger or disappointment. The other students in class are learning at different speeds, and nobody treats that like a moral failing. I realize that language learning can actually be enjoyable when it's your choice and when mistakes are treated as normal parts of the process. During one class, we watch a video about a festival in Spain, and the teacher asks what we think about it, and I answer in English without even thinking about it, and she's totally fine with that. The freedom to use whatever language I need to express myself feels revolutionary. Maybe someday I'll actually become fluent in Spanish, but it'll be because I chose it, not because someone threatened me into it. After 3 weeks in foster care, Wyatt starts sleeping through most nights without waking up from nightmares. His therapist tells the caseworker he's making good progress, even though he still has bad days sometimes. I watch my little brother slowly relax and act more like a normal 11-year-old, laughing at dumb jokes and playing video games and complaining about homework in ways that feel wonderfully ordinary. He's still anxious sometimes, and loud noises make him jumpy, but he's not having panic attacks every other day anymore. Seeing him get better makes me feel like we made the right choice, even though it was terrifying to trigger that app and call the police and basically blow up our family. The foster mom says healing isn't linear and we'll both have setbacks. But the important thing is we're safe now and have time to figure out who we are without constant fear. Some days I still feel guilty about what happened to Mom and Dad, but then I remember the bruises and the thrown books and Wyatt crying before his lessons. And I know we couldn't have kept living that way. We saved ourselves, and maybe that's enough for now. 6 weeks later, Mom and Dad finished their court-ordered parenting classes, and the judge approved supervised visits at a family center downtown. The first visit happens on a Saturday afternoon, and I sit across from them at a table with plastic chairs while a social worker watches from a desk in the corner. Mom keeps her hands folded on the table, and Dad asks how school is going in this weird, formal voice, like we're strangers at a job interview. I tell them school is fine, and Wyatt says his math teacher is nice, and there's this horrible silence where nobody knows what to say next. Mom starts crying quietly, and Dad puts his hand over hers, but doesn't look at us. And the whole thing lasts exactly 1 hour that feels like 6. Walking out to the foster mom's car afterward, my phone buzzes with a text from Louise that's really long, like 3 screens worth of words. I read the first part where she says she's sorry we got hurt, but she still thinks languages are beautiful. And maybe Mom and Dad just loved us too much in the wrong way. The rest is her explaining how she turned out okay and how she's grateful for what she learned, even if the methods were harsh. I don't know what to say back, so I just save the message in a folder and tell myself I'll think about it when I'm ready, maybe in a few months or maybe never. One evening after dinner, I'm sitting on the bed in my foster room with my laptop, and I open the support forum where I first posted months ago, asking if my situation was actually abuse. I create a new anonymous account and start typing out everything that happened from the beginning, with the 6-language schedule through the removal and court and coming back here. My fingers move fast across the keyboard, and I don't stop to edit or make it sound good. Just let the whole story pour out in one long post that takes me almost an hour to write. I read it over once to make sure I didn't include any identifying details, then hit submit before I can change my mind. Within 20 minutes, people start responding with comments like, "This is absolutely abuse, and I'm so glad you're safe now, and your parents need serious help." Someone shares a similar story about their mom, forcing them to practice violin 8 hours a day. And another person says they reported their parents for educational abuse, too. Reading through the responses makes my chest feel warm and tight at the same time, because these people believe me and understand, and nobody is saying I'm being dramatic or ungrateful. There's no happy ending to write yet because Mom and Dad are still doing supervised visits, and Wyatt still has nightmares sometimes. And I don't know if our family will ever be normal. But typing out the truth and having people see it, that matters in a way I can't fully explain. Walking home from my Spanish class the next Wednesday, I practice saying "Me gusta aprender español" out loud to myself, then immediately switch to English and say, "I like learning Spanish just because I can." Nobody is monitoring which language comes out of my mouth, or timing how long I stay in each one, or threatening punishment if I mix them up. The freedom to choose feels like something I stole back from Mom and Dad, like reclaiming a part of myself they tried to own. I think about how healing probably isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't mess me up, but about deciding who I want to be now that I'm safe. Maybe I'll keep learning Spanish because I actually enjoy it, or maybe I'll quit and try something completely different like art or music. The point is, it's my choice now, and that's what matters most. So yeah, that's where I am. It's a lot, I know. I still have a long way to go, but at least I'm on my own path. I guess I'm curious, after hearing all this, what would you have done in my place? Have you ever had to fight for your own freedom like this? Let me know in the comments. I really want to hear what you think.